Sometime around the year 306 BCE, a man in his mid-30s purchased a modest property on the outskirts of Athens. It was not much to look at. A small house, a walled garden, a patch of land that would never have impressed the wealthy citizens who lived closer to the agora. The man was not wealthy. He had no political connections, no aristocratic lineage, no inherited fortune. What he had was an idea, and the idea was this, that the point of life is to stop being afraid. His name was Epicurus. The property he bought became known simply as the Garden, and for the next 4 decades, until the day he died, it served as the home of a philosophical community unlike anything Athens had ever seen. Other schools had their grand buildings, their lecture halls, their prestigious addresses. Plato's academy lay in a sacred grove outside the city walls. Aristotle's Lyceum occupied a gymnasium near the Temple of Apollo. The Stoics gathered in the Stoa Poikile, the painted porch, in the heart of the Athenian marketplace. Epicurus chose a garden. The choice was deliberate. Everything about the garden was a statement. To understand what that statement meant and why it mattered enough for powerful institutions to spend the next 2,000 years trying to destroy it, we need to understand the world Epicurus was born into and the life that brought him to that modest property in Athens. Epicurus was born in 341 BCE on the island of Samos, one of the most beautiful and prosperous of the Greek islands, lying in the eastern Aegean Sea, just a short distance from the coast of what is now Turkey. Samos was famous for its wine, its engineering marvels, including a great tunnel driven through a mountain by the tyrant Polycrates, and for being the birthplace of the mathematician Pythagoras. His father Neocles was an Athenian citizen who had settled on Samos as a klerouk, a colonial landholder. His mother Cheristrate was, according to hostile later sources, a woman who went from house to house performing purification rituals and reciting charms. Whether this is true or a slander invented by Epicurus's many enemies is impossible to know. What we do know is that the family was not wealthy. Epicurus grew up in a world where philosophy was not a luxury, but a response to genuine hardship. He later said that he first turned to philosophy at the age of 14, when his schoolteacher could not explain to him the meaning of chaos in the poetry of Hesiod. The teacher's failure sent him looking for answers elsewhere, and what he found changed the direction of his life. The world of Epicurus's youth was a world in upheaval. Alexander the Great had died in 323 BCE, and his vast empire was being torn apart by his generals, the Diadochi, who fought brutal wars of succession across the eastern Mediterranean. The old certainties of the Greek city-state were dissolving. Athens, once the dominant power in the Greek world, was now a second-tier city subject to the whims of Macedonian warlords. Samos itself was seized, and its Athenian settlers expelled in 322 BCE, when Epicurus was 19 years old. He lost his home. His family was scattered. He spent the next years wandering, studying, teaching in small cities along the coast of Asia Minor, first in Colophon, then in Mytilene, on the island of Lesbos, then in Lampsacus, on the Hellespont. These years of displacement shaped his philosophy in ways that are not always appreciated. Epicurus was not a man who theorized about suffering from the comfort of a tenured position. He knew what it meant to be uprooted, to lose everything, to live in a world where political violence was constant and unpredictable. He had completed his mandatory military service in Athens at 18, where according to one tradition he served in the same ephebic class as the young playwright Menander, whose comedies of ordinary human frustration would become some of the most popular works in the ancient world. But unlike Menander, whose art reflected the messiness of social life, Epicurus was already looking for something beneath the surface of things, a principle that would hold firm no matter what the world did to you. The philosophy he developed was not an academic exercise, it was a survival strategy, a way of constructing an inner life so stable and so clear that no external catastrophe could entirely destroy it. During his years in Asia Minor, Epicurus studied with Nausiphanes, a follower of Democritus, the great atomist philosopher who had argued a century earlier that everything in the universe is composed of tiny, indivisible particles moving through empty space. Democritus called these particles atoms, from the Greek word atomos, meaning uncuttable. This encounter with atomism was decisive. Epicurus took the physics of Democritus and built upon it an entire system of thought, a complete philosophy that encompassed physics, epistemology, and ethics in a unified whole. The atoms were not just a theory about the nature of matter, they were the foundation of a new way of understanding the gods, death, pleasure, and the purpose of human life. By the time Epicurus arrived in Athens and purchased his garden around 306 BCE, he had already gathered a devoted following. The community he established there was extraordinary for its time, and it would have been extraordinary in almost any time. The garden admitted women, it admitted slaves, it admitted foreigners. In a city where women were confined to the household, where slaves were considered property, and where foreigners were permanently excluded from citizenship, this was an act of quiet but unmistakable radicalism. Epicurus did not argue publicly for the abolition of slavery or the political equality of women. He simply treated everyone who came to the garden as a fellow human being capable of philosophy, and in doing so, he undermined the social hierarchies of his world more effectively than any political manifesto could have done. The most prominent women in the garden included Leontian, who became a philosopher in her own right and wrote a treatise criticizing the work of Theophrastus, Aristotle's successor at the Lyceum. That a woman would publicly challenge one of the most respected philosophers in Athens was scandalous. That she did so from a garden on the outskirts of the city, under the guidance of a philosopher whom the establishment already regarded with suspicion, made it all the more provocative. Metrodorus and his wife Leontion, Hermarchus, Colotes, Polyaenus. These were the inner circle, the friends who lived with Epicurus, studied with him, ate with him, and carried his philosophy forward after his death. The daily life of the garden was simple. The community shared meals of bread and water, with cheese and wine reserved for special occasions. There were no lectures in the formal sense, no hierarchical relationship between master and pupil of the kind that characterized the academy or the lyceum. Epicurus taught through conversation, through letters, through shared meals, and through the example of his own life. He wrote constantly, corresponding with Epicurean communities across the Greek world, offering counsel, encouragement, and philosophical argument to followers he might never meet in person. The garden was not a university. It was closer to what we might now recognize as an intentional community, a group of people who had chosen to live according to a shared set of principles. Epicurus was not performing austerity for its own sake. He genuinely believed that simple pleasures, freely available, were superior to elaborate ones that required wealth, status, or constant effort to maintain. A glass of water when you are thirsty, he taught, is more pleasurable than a feast when you are not hungry. The point is not to deny yourself good things, but to understand which good things actually matter and which ones create more anxiety than they resolve. This was the core of Epicurus's ethical teaching, and it was precisely this teaching that would be systematically distorted by his enemies for the next 23 centuries. The word Epicurean in modern English means devoted to luxury and sensual pleasure. It suggests rich food, fine wine, silk sheets, and an attitude of self-indulgent sophistication. This is almost exactly the opposite of what Epicurus actually taught. The distortion was not accidental. It was a deliberate campaign of misrepresentation, begun by rival philosophical schools in his own lifetime and amplified enormously by the Christian Church in the centuries that followed. Epicurus wrote prolifically. Ancient sources credit him with roughly 300 scrolls, making him one of the most productive writers in the history of philosophy. Almost all of it is gone. What survives is heartbreakingly little. 3 letters preserved by the biographer Diogenes Laertius in his Lives of the Eminent Philosophers, written in the 3rd century CE, a collection of short maxims known as the Principal Doctrines, a similar collection called the Vatican Sayings, discovered in a Vatican manuscript in 1888, and scattered fragments, quotations and references in the works of later writers. The survival of even this much is something of a miracle. The destruction of the rest was not the work of time alone. Epicurean texts were actively suppressed, deliberately not copied, systematically allowed to decay in monastery libraries where monks preserved the works of Plato and Aristotle with care, but let the scrolls of Epicurus rot. We know Epicurus's philosophy primarily through 2 indirect sources. The first is the Roman poet Lucretius, who composed a magnificent philosophical poem called On the Nature of Things around 55 BCE, 2 centuries after Epicurus's death. The poem presents Epicurean physics, theology, and ethics in 6 books of Latin verse, and it is one of the great literary achievements of the ancient world. The second is Diogenes Laertius, whose 10th book of the Lives is devoted entirely to Epicurus and preserves the 3 surviving letters along with the Principal Doctrines. Without these 2 writers, we would know Epicurus mainly through the attacks of his enemies, which is roughly how most of Western civilization has known him for the past 2 millennia. The label Epicurean as a term of abuse was, in other words, the product of a sustained and deliberate propaganda campaign. It began with the Stoics and it was amplified, as we shall see, by the early Christian Church. The success of this campaign is one of the most remarkable episodes in the history of ideas. A philosopher who ate bread and drank water and lived in a garden has been remembered for 23 centuries as the patron saint of luxury. The real Epicurus would have found the irony almost amusing. What Epicurus built in the garden was not merely a school, it was an experiment in living, a demonstration that philosophy is not something you study, but something you practice, not an ornament for the mind, but a medicine for the soul. He used exactly this analogy. Philosophy that does not heal the soul, he said, is no better than medicine that does not heal the body. The garden was his clinic, and the patients were anyone willing to walk through the gate. The treatment he offered rested on 4 claims, which a later Epicurean writer condensed into a formula known as the 4-part cure, the Tetrapharmakos. God is not to be feared. Death is not to be worried about. What is good is easy to get. What is painful is easy to endure. These 4 propositions, stated so simply that they might seem like platitudes, are the concentrated result of a complete philosophical system. Behind each one stands a careful argument grounded in Epicurean physics, a theory of nature that explains why each claim is true and how understanding its truth can liberate a person from the anxieties that make human life miserable. Epicurus died in 270 BCE at the age of 71 after suffering for 14 days from a blockage of the urinary tract, likely kidney stones. According to Diogenes Laertius, he bore his final illness with extraordinary composure. On the last day of his life, he wrote a letter to his friend Idomeneus. He reported that his pain was severe, that his body was failing, but that against all of this he set the memory of the philosophical conversations they had shared together, and that this memory brought him joy that outweighed the suffering. Then he climbed into a bronze bath of warm water, asked for a cup of wine, drank it, told his friends to remember his teachings, and died. The garden continued after his death, led by Hermarchus and then by a succession of scholarchs who maintained the community and its teachings for centuries. Epicurean communities spread across the Greek and Roman world, from Athens to Rome to the cities of Asia Minor. In the 2nd century CE, a wealthy Epicurean named Diogenes of Oenoanda had the principal doctrines of Epicurus carved into a massive stone wall in his city in southern Turkey, so that anyone passing by could read them and be cured of their fears. Fragments of that wall survive today, a philosophy literally carved in stone, still legible after nearly 2,000 years. And yet, despite the devotion of his followers, despite the wall of Diogenes and the poem of Lucretius, and the letters preserved by chance in the pages of a late antique biographer, Epicurus came closer to being erased from history than almost any major philosopher. The forces that sought his destruction were formidable. They included the most powerful religious institution the world has ever known. They very nearly succeeded. That they did not, that the philosophy of the garden survived its long persecution and emerged into the modern world to find an audience larger and more sympathetic than Epicurus could ever have imagined, is a story worth telling. It begins with atoms. About a century before Epicurus was born, a philosopher named Democritus lived in the city of Abdera, in the northern reaches of the Greek world. Democritus was, by all accounts, a man of extraordinary range. He wrote on ethics, mathematics, music, agriculture, painting, and medicine. But his most enduring contribution was a single, staggering claim about the nature of reality. Everything that exists, Democritus argued, is made of two things: atoms and void. Tiny, indivisible particles, too small to see, too fundamental to break apart, moving through empty space. That is all there is. Everything else, every tree, every stone, every human body, every thought, is atoms arranged in different patterns, colliding, combining, separating, and recombining across infinite time. This was not a mystical intuition, it was a reasoned argument. Democritus observed that matter can be divided. A block of wood can be cut in half, and each half can be cut again. But this process cannot continue forever, because if it did, matter would dissolve into nothing. There must be a point at which division stops, a smallest possible unit of matter that cannot be cut further. He called these units atoms, from the Greek atomos, meaning uncuttable. Between the atoms there must be empty space, void, through which the atoms move. Without void there would be no room for motion, and without motion there would be no change. Epicurus encountered this idea through his teacher Nausiphanes and recognized in it something that went far beyond physics. Here was a theory that could explain not only the behavior of matter, but the nature of the gods, the reality of death, and the possibility of human freedom. Epicurus took the atomism of Democritus and made it the foundation of a complete philosophical system. Where Democritus had proposed a physical theory, Epicurus built a way of life. The Epicurean universe is infinite. There is no edge, no boundary, no containing wall beyond which existence ends. Atoms are infinite in number and have always existed. They were not created. They cannot be destroyed. They are eternal, fundamental, and everywhere. They differ from one another only in shape, size, and weight. Some are smooth, some are rough, some are hooked in ways that allow them to cling together. When atoms combine in certain arrangements, they produce the objects we perceive: rocks, water, flesh, bone. When those arrangements break apart, the atoms scatter and recombine into something else. Nothing comes from nothing, and nothing is ever truly annihilated. There is only rearrangement. Epicurus also developed a theory of perception to explain how we come to know this atomic world. Objects, he argued, constantly shed thin films of atoms from their surfaces, like a snake shedding its skin, but continuously and invisibly. These films, which he called images or eidola, travel through the air and strike our sense organs, producing the experience of sight, hearing, smell, and touch. Perception is always reliable in the strict sense that the images are real, physical objects that genuinely reach us. Error enters not in the perception itself, but in the judgments we form about what the perception means. When a tower appears round from a distance and square up close, both perceptions are real. The mistake lies in concluding from the distant view that the tower is round. This theory of knowledge, grounded entirely in the physical interaction of atoms, gave Epicurus something that many ancient philosophers lacked: a reason to trust the evidence of the senses. In a philosophical world dominated by Plato's suspicion that the senses deceive us, and that true knowledge lies in a realm of abstract forms accessible only to pure reason, Epicurus insisted that the senses are our primary and most reliable source of information about reality. We do not need to escape the material world to understand it. We need to pay attention to it. Consider what this means. If everything is atoms and void, then there is no supernatural realm. There is no immaterial soul. There are no divine forces shaping the world according to a plan. Lightning is not a weapon hurled by Zeus. Earthquakes are not punishments inflicted by Poseidon. The plague that devastates a city is not a sign of divine displeasure. These events have natural causes, mechanical causes, causes rooted in the behavior of atoms. The universe is not governed by intention, it is governed by physics. Epicurus spelled this out with remarkable clarity in his letter to Herodotus, one of the 3 surviving letters and the most important summary of his physical theory that we possess. This is not the famous Herodotus who wrote the histories. This was a friend and fellow Epicurean to whom Epicurus addressed a compressed overview of his entire physics, designed to be memorized and consulted whenever the student needed to recall the fundamentals. "Nothing comes into being from what does not exist," he wrote. "For if it did, anything would come into being from anything, with no need for seeds. And if what disappears were destroyed into what does not exist, all things would have perished, since that into which they were dissolved does not exist. This principle of conservation, that matter is neither created nor destroyed, but only transformed, is so close to modern physics that it can feel anachronistic. But Epicurus arrived at it not through experiment, but through argument, working from the premise that a universe built on nothing would produce nothing, and therefore the fundamental components of reality must be permanent. The atoms move. In the Epicurean system, atoms are in constant motion, falling through the void under the influence of their own weight. But here Epicurus departed from Democritus in a way that would prove philosophically crucial. In the original atomism of Democritus, the motion of atoms was entirely determined by their prior collisions. Every event was the inevitable result of events before it, stretching back through infinite time in an unbroken chain of cause and effect. This was a deterministic universe, a cosmic machine in which every event was the inevitable and unalterable consequence of the events that preceded it, stretching backward through infinite time. In such a universe, the future was already fixed by the past, and free will was an illusion. Epicurus saw the problem immediately. If every atom moves according to a fixed trajectory determined by prior collisions, then every event in the universe, including every human thought and every human decision, is predetermined. There is no genuine choice. There is no real agency. You are not deciding to read this or deciding not to. The atoms in your brain were always going to arrange themselves in exactly this way, and you were always going to do exactly what you are doing. Epicurus found this intolerable, not because he could prove it was false through formal logic, but because a philosophy that denies human freedom cannot serve as a guide to living well. If you cannot choose, then advice is meaningless. Ethics is meaningless. The entire project of philosophy as a practice collapses. His solution was the swerve. At unpredictable intervals, Epicurus proposed, an atom will deviate slightly from its expected path, not by much, a tiny random deflection, just enough to break the deterministic chain. This deviation, which the Roman poet Lucretius would later call the clinamen, is what makes everything possible. Without the swerve, the atoms would fall in parallel lines through the void forever, never colliding, never combining, never producing anything at all. Without the swerve, there would be no world, and without the swerve, there would be no free will. The unpredictability at the foundation of nature is what opens the space for genuine human choice. The swerve has been the most debated element of Epicurean physics for over 2,000 years. Critics, both ancient and modern, have attacked it as an ad hoc invention, a convenient dodge introduced solely to rescue free will from the deterministic implications of atomism. And there is some justice to this criticism. Epicurus never provided a mechanism for the swerve. He never explained why atoms swerve or when they will do so. He simply asserted that they do, and built his ethics on this assertion. But the swerve also represents something deeper than a technical fix. It is an acknowledgement that the universe contains genuine novelty, that not everything can be predicted from what came before, that the future is genuinely open. This is an idea that modern physics, with its quantum indeterminacy and its probabilistic descriptions of subatomic behavior, has arrived at by a completely different route. One should be careful with such comparisons. Epicurus was not doing quantum mechanics. He had no concept of wave functions or probability amplitudes. The resemblance between the Epicurean swerve and quantum indeterminacy is suggestive rather than substantive. But it is worth noting that the ancient philosopher who insisted that the universe must contain irreducible randomness turns out to have been closer to the modern understanding of physics than the ancient philosophers who insisted on perfect determinism. Epicurus also used his physics to explain the existence of multiple worlds. If atoms are infinite in number and the void is infinite in extent, then the collisions that produced our world must have produced other worlds as well, an infinite number of them, scattered through infinite space. Some of these worlds resemble ours, others are radically different. They form, they persist for a time, they decay and dissolve, and their atoms recombine into new worlds. Our world is not special. It is not the center of anything. It is one arrangement among an infinite number of arrangements, temporary and contingent, produced by the same blind mechanical processes that produce everything else. This vision of cosmic plurality was extraordinary for its time. Most Greek philosophers assumed that our world was unique, that it was the product of deliberate design, that it occupied a privileged place in the order of things. Epicurus swept all of this away. The implications of this atomic worldview extend in every direction. If everything is composed of atoms and void, then the distinction between the natural and the supernatural collapses entirely. There is no supernatural. There is only the natural, the immense and astonishing behavior of atoms through infinite time and space, producing by their interactions every phenomenon that human beings have ever attributed to gods or spirits or magical forces. The soul in Epicurean physics is not an exception to the atomic theory. It is an application of it. The soul is material. It is composed of atoms, specifically of very fine, smooth atoms distributed throughout the body. These soul atoms are what make sensation possible. When the atoms of the soul interact with the atoms of external objects, we perceive. When the soul atoms are disturbed, we feel pain. When they are tranquil, we feel pleasure. And when the body dies, the soul atoms disperse, scattering back into the void to recombine in other forms. There is no survival after death. There is no ghost that lingers. There is no consciousness that endures without a body to house it. The soul is as mortal as the flesh. This was not a minor technical point. It was the ethical heart of Epicurean physics. If the soul is mortal, then there is no afterlife. If there is no afterlife, then there is no divine judgment, no eternal punishment, no hell. The terrors that religion uses to control human behavior lose their power entirely. You cannot threaten a man with damnation if he knows that death is simply the end of experience. Epicurus understood this with perfect clarity, and he considered the liberation from the fear of posthumous punishment to be one of the greatest gifts his philosophy could offer. The universe, in the Epicurean picture, is not hostile. It is not friendly. It is not watching. It simply is. Atoms fall through the void, swerve, collide, combine, and separate. Worlds form and worlds dissolve. Life arises and life ends. None of this is planned. None of this is purposeful. And yet, Epicurus insisted, none of this is cause for despair. The absence of cosmic purpose does not make human life meaningless. It makes human life free. If no God has determined your fate, then your fate is your own. If no divine law dictates how you must live, then you can choose how to live based on what actually produces well-being, rather than on what a priest tells you the gods demand. This is why the physics matters. Every claim Epicurus makes about how to live well rests on a claim about how the universe works. The ethics cannot stand without the physics. If the soul is immortal, then death might be something to fear. If the gods intervene in human affairs, then religious devotion is rational self-interest. If the universe is governed by fate, then human choice is an illusion. Epicurus denied all three propositions, and he denied them not on the basis of faith or intuition, but on the basis of a physical theory that he believed accounted for every phenomenon in the natural world. The atoms and the void. This was the starting point. Everything else, the theology, the ethics, the politics, the theory of pleasure and pain, follows from these two simple realities. There is matter, and there is the space through which matter moves. To most of Epicurus's contemporaries, this seemed hopelessly reductive, a philosophy that stripped the world of meaning and beauty. To Epicurus, it was the opposite. It was a philosophy that stripped the world of terror. From atoms and void, an entire system of human liberation. From atoms and void, a life without fear. In the Athens of Epicurus's time, religion was not a private matter. It was woven into every aspect of public life. The Panathenaic festival honoured Athena with a great procession through the city, animal sacrifices on the Acropolis, and athletic competitions that drew participants from across the Greek world. The Eleusinian mysteries promised initiates a blessed afterlife through secret rituals performed in the sanctuary at Eleusis. The oracle at Delphi shaped military strategy and political decision-making for city-states across Greece. When the plague struck Athens during the Peloponnesian War in 430 BCE, citizens debated whether it was a punishment from Apollo. When an earthquake shattered a city, people asked which god they had offended. The divine was not an abstract concept to be discussed in seminar rooms. It was an active, terrifying presence that could bless you or destroy you at any moment for reasons you might never understand. Into this world, Epicurus introduced a claim so radical that it would take 2 millennia to absorb its full implications. He did not deny that the gods existed. This is an important distinction that is often missed. He was not an atheist in the modern sense of the word. He believed that the gods were real, that they were composed of atoms like everything else, and that they lived in a state of perfect, eternal happiness. What he denied, with a clarity and directness that scandalized his contemporaries and enraged his later critics, was that the gods had any involvement whatsoever in human affairs. They did not create the world. They did not sustain it. They did not observe it. The entire apparatus of religious fear, the sacrifices, the oracles, the prophecies, the threats of divine punishment, rested on a mistake about the nature of divinity itself. The gods in Epicurus's account live in the spaces between worlds, regions that the later Epicurean tradition called the intermundia. These are calm, undisturbed zones of the cosmos, free from the collisions and disruptions that characterize the worlds themselves. The gods exist there in perfect tranquility, experiencing the undisturbed mind, ataraxia, and the body free from pain, aponia, that Epicurus identified as the highest goods available to any conscious being. They do not create worlds. They do not govern them. They do not observe human behavior, respond to prayers, punish sinners, or reward the virtuous. They are entirely self-sufficient, entirely content, entirely indifferent to what happens anywhere outside their own experience. Epicurus arrived at this position through the logic of his own physics. If the universe is the product of atoms colliding in the void, then no divine intelligence designed it. The world was not created for us. The human eye was not fashioned by a craftsman god to perceive beauty. The seasons do not change because a deity wills them to change. These phenomena have natural explanations, mechanical explanations, explanations grounded in the behavior of atoms. To attribute them to divine agency is not only wrong but harmful because it encourages fear. If you believe that the gods control the weather, then every thunderstorm becomes a potential sign of divine anger. If you believe that the gods punish wickedness, then every misfortune becomes evidence of your own moral failure. And if you believe that the gods can torment you after death, then your entire life is lived in the shadow of a terror that nothing can dispel. This was the terror that Epicurus wanted to cure. He saw it everywhere around him. He saw it in the sacrifices that families could not afford but made anyway out of fear. He saw it in the prophets and diviners who exploited that fear for profit. He saw it in the political leaders who invoked divine authority to justify wars and persecutions. And he saw it in the quiet private suffering of ordinary people who lay awake at night, wondering what the gods wanted from them, wondering what they had done wrong, wondering what punishments awaited them after death. His response was not to mock religion or to campaign for its abolition. It was to offer an alternative account of the gods that preserved their existence while eliminating their threat. The gods are real, he taught, but they are not watching you. They are not testing you. They are not angry with you. They live in a bliss so complete that your existence does not register in their consciousness at all. This is not a depressing thought. It is a liberating one. You are free from their demands because they make no demands. You are free from their judgment because they pass no judgment. You are free. How did Epicurus know the gods existed at all if they had no interaction with the world? His answer was characteristic of his empiricism. All human beings in every culture have a concept of the gods. This universal concept, this preconception or prolepsis, cannot be baseless. It must have some origin in experience. Epicurus argued that the gods, like all atomic structures, emit thin films of atoms from their surfaces. These divine images travel across the vast spaces of the cosmos and reach human minds, especially during sleep, when the mind is quiet enough to register impressions that the noise of waking life would drown out. The images of the gods that appear in dreams are not fantasies. They are genuine, if faint, impressions of real beings. What is fantastical is the interpretation that human culture has layered on top of these impressions. The stories of jealousy, rage, and intervention that bear no resemblance to the actual nature of a blessed and eternal being. Epicurus went further. He argued that the popular images of the gods, the angry, jealous, vengeful deities of Greek mythology, were not just inaccurate, but actively blasphemous. A truly blessed being, he reasoned, would not experience anger. Think about what anger actually is. It is a response to perceived injury, a form of pain that arises when something you value is threatened or damaged. But a being that is perfectly self-sufficient, perfectly complete, perfectly content, has nothing that can be threatened and nothing that can be damaged. Anger is a form of disturbance, and the gods are by definition undisturbed. A truly blessed being would not experience jealousy, or resentment, or the desire for revenge. These are all forms of suffering, and the gods do not suffer. To attribute these emotions to the divine is to project human weakness onto beings that are free from it. The traditional gods, with their feuds and favourites and petty cruelties, are human fantasies, reflections of human anxiety dressed in divine clothing. The real gods, if we could see them, would look nothing like the figures in the myths. They would look like what perfect happiness looks like. And perfect happiness does not punish. This theology had practical consequences that extended far beyond the philosophical schools, far beyond the conversations in the garden, and into the daily emotional lives of ordinary people. Consider what it meant to live in a world where every unexplained event was potentially a message from the gods. A bird flying on your left side before a battle could mean defeat. A comet could signal the death of a king. A child born with a deformity could be read as a sign of parental sin. The ancient world was saturated with omens, portents, and signs, and the industry of interpreting them employed thousands of priests, augurs, haruspices, and oracles across the Mediterranean. Epicurus rejected the entire framework. If the gods do not intervene in nature, then natural phenomena have natural causes. Earthquakes are caused by subterranean winds and pressures, not by the anger of Poseidon. Eclipses are caused by the movements of celestial bodies, not by the displeasure of the sun god. Disease arises from the composition and behavior of atoms within the body, not from curses or divine retribution. In his letter to Pythocles, Epicurus addressed meteorological phenomena in exactly this spirit, offering multiple possible natural explanations for thunder, lightning, clouds, rain, and earthquakes, and insisting that the student choose among them based on observation rather than superstition. The specific explanations he offered were often wrong. He proposed, for instance, that thunder might be caused by wind trapped in clouds, and that earthquakes might result from wind trapped underground. He did not have the tools or the data to determine the correct mechanisms. But accuracy on individual phenomena was not his primary concern. His concern was the method itself. As long as you seek natural explanations for natural events, you will never need to invoke divine anger. And as long as you never invoke divine anger, you will never be afraid of the sky. The method was revolutionary. Explain nature by nature, not by invoking the gods. The proper attitude toward the gods, then, is not fear but admiration. We should contemplate them as examples of what perfect happiness looks like. We should admire their tranquility, their freedom from disturbance, their complete self-sufficiency. In this sense, the Epicurean relationship to the divine is closer to aesthetic appreciation than to worship. You do not pray to a sunset. You do not beg a mountain for favors. You simply recognize something magnificent and allow the recognition to affect you. This is what Epicurus meant when he said that the wise person will honor the gods. The honoring is real. The fear is gone. One can imagine the reaction in the streets of Athens. Here was a man teaching that the gods, those powerful beings whose festivals structured the civic calendar and whose temples dominated the cityscape, simply did not care about human beings. That the sacrifices, the prayers, the rituals, the expensive dedications that filled the treasuries of temples across the Greek world were directed at beings who could not hear them and would not respond even if they could. For the priests whose livelihoods depended on these rituals, this was an economic threat. For the politicians who used religious authority to maintain social order, it was a political threat. For the ordinary believers who found comfort in the idea that the gods watched over them and would reward their devotion, it was an existential challenge. A claim that the cosmic companionship they relied on was a misunderstanding. The comfort of being watched, of knowing that someone powerful was paying attention to your struggles and your prayers, was precisely what Epicurus was asking them to give up. The charge of atheism followed Epicurus through his lifetime and long after his death. It was, in a sense, inevitable. A man who teaches that the gods do not answer prayers will always be accused of teaching that there are no gods, regardless of how carefully he distinguishes between the two claims. In ancient Athens, the charge of impiety, asabeia, carried real legal weight. Socrates had been executed for it in 399 BCE, less than a century before Epicurus opened the garden. Anaxagoras had been prosecuted for it. Protagoras had been exiled for it. Epicurus was aware of these precedents, and he navigated the danger with a combination of philosophical honesty and social prudence. He counseled his followers to participate in civic religious festivals, to observe the customary rituals, to avoid unnecessary confrontation with the religious authorities. This was not hypocrisy, it was prudence. The garden could not serve as a refuge from anxiety if its members were constantly embroiled in public controversies. Live unnoticed, Epicurus advised, and this applied to theological disputes as much as to political ambitions. Let the priests perform their sacrifices. Let the populace attend their festivals. The Epicurean knows the truth, and the truth is sufficient. There is no need to make a spectacle of one's liberation. But the truth, once spoken, cannot be unspoken. And the truth Epicurus spoke struck at the foundation of religious authority in a way that would echo across the centuries. The Stoics could be accommodated by Christianity because the Stoics believed in divine providence, in a rational God who governed the cosmos with wisdom and purpose. Plato could be absorbed because Plato believed in the immortality of the soul and in a transcendent realm of perfect forms that bore a family resemblance to the Christian heaven. Aristotle could be baptized because Aristotle's unmoved mover could be reinterpreted as the Christian God. But Epicurus could not be accommodated, absorbed, or baptized. His theology was not merely different from the theology of Christianity, it was its direct negation. A God who does not create, does not judge, does not punish, and does not reward is not a God that any religion built on the promise of salvation and the threat of damnation can tolerate. And so the long war began. It would be fought not with swords but with ink and silence, with the deliberate corruption of texts and the strategic refusal to copy them, with slander and caricature and the slow, patient work of making a philosopher's name synonymous with everything he opposed. But that story belongs to a later chapter. For now, the point is this. Epicurus looked at a world paralyzed by religious fear and offered a simple, devastating diagnosis. The fear is based on a misunderstanding. The gods are real, but they do not care about you. This is not a reason for despair. It is a reason for relief. The weight you have been carrying, the weight of divine expectation, divine surveillance, divine judgment, was never real. You have been afraid of something that was never going to happen. Set the weight down. You are free to live. Of all the fears that Epicurus sought to cure, the fear of death was the one he considered most urgent and most destructive. It was the fear that coloured every other fear. It was the reason people pursued wealth they did not need, power they could not hold, pleasures that left them emptier than before. It was the source of the desperate grasping that made so many lives miserable. If you could remove the fear of death, Epicurus believed, most of the other anxieties that plague human beings would collapse on their own. The fear of death was the root. Pull it out, and the entire weed comes with it. His argument against this fear is perhaps the most famous single contribution Epicurus made to philosophy. It has been debated, defended, attacked, and refined for 23 centuries, and it remains, even now, one of the most discussed problems in the philosophy of death. The argument is deceptively simple. It can be stated in a single sentence, which Epicurus himself provided in his letter to Menicius. Death is nothing to us, since when we exist, death is not present, and when death is present, we do not exist. The logic is elegant, and it rewards careful attention. An experience can only be good or bad for a person if that person exists to have it. This is not a controversial premise. It is, when you consider it, almost a tautology. Death is the end of existence. Therefore, death is not an experience. It is the cessation of all experience. You will never encounter your own death. You will never be in a state of being dead, looking around, noticing the darkness, regretting what you left behind. There is no darkness. There is no regret. There is nothing at all. And what is nothing cannot harm you. To appreciate the force of this argument, one must understand just how terrifying the ancient afterlife was for most people. The Greek underworld, Hades, was not a place of rest. It was a realm of shadows, a dim and joyless kingdom beneath the earth, where the shades of the dead drifted without purpose, without strength, without the pleasures of the body they had lost. In the Odyssey, the ghost of the great warrior Achilles tells Odysseus that he would rather be a living servant to a poor man than king of all the dead. This was not a comforting vision. And beyond the general gloom, there were the specific punishments. Tantalus, standing in a pool of water that receded every time he bent to drink, beneath fruit trees whose branches lifted every time he reached for them. Sisyphus, condemned to roll a boulder up a hill for eternity, only to watch it roll back down. Ixion, bound to a wheel of fire. These images haunted the Greek imagination, and the fear they generated was not limited to the educated elite. Ordinary people, people who worked fields and fished harbours and raised children, lived with the real possibility that something terrible awaited them after death. Epicurus drew the same conclusion from his physics. The soul is made of atoms. When the body dies, the atoms of the soul disperse. Consciousness requires a specific configuration of soul atoms within a functioning body. When that configuration dissolves, consciousness ends. There is no ghostly residue that lingers. There is no shade that descends to an underworld. There is no immaterial essence that floats free of the body to face judgment. These are stories, and the stories have caused incalculable suffering. The person who fears the torments of Tartarus, the river of fire, the eternal thirst of Tantalus, the stone of Sisyphus, is afraid of things that will never happen. Not because the afterlife might turn out to be pleasant, but because the afterlife does not exist. But Epicurus knew that simply stating this argument would not be enough to cure the fear. The fear of death is not primarily a logical error. It is an emotional condition, rooted deep in human psychology, reinforced by culture and religion, fed by the imagination every time it conjures images of loss, darkness, and oblivion. A person lying awake at night terrified of dying is not going to be reassured by a syllogism. Epicurus understood this, and he offered something more than logic. He offered a way of reframing the relationship between self and time that, if genuinely absorbed, could transform the way a person experiences mortality. This is the symmetry argument, and it is the most psychologically powerful tool in the Epicurean arsenal. Consider the time before you were born. There were billions of years of history, of empires rising and falling, of species appearing and vanishing, of stars igniting and dying before you existed. You were absent for all of it, You missed the eruption of Vesuvius in 79 CE, but of course you also missed the eruption of Thera around 1600 BCE. You missed the construction of the pyramids. You missed the extinction of the dinosaurs. You missed everything that happened before the particular atoms that compose your body assembled into the particular configuration that is you. And here is the question Epicurus poses. Did that trouble you? Were you suffering during all those eons of non-existence? Were you lying in some prenatal void, anxious about the delay, wondering when your life would finally begin? Obviously not. You were not there. There was no you to suffer, no you to worry, no you to experience the absence as a deprivation. Prenatal non-existence was not painful, not boring, not frightening. It was nothing. You did not even notice it because there was no one to notice. Now consider the time after your death. It will also be a period of non-existence. You will not be present. There will be no you to suffer, no you to regret, no you to experience the absence of life as a loss. Post-mortem non-existence will be, from your perspective, exactly like prenatal non-existence. It will be nothing. And if prenatal nothing did not trouble you, why should post-mortem nothing trouble you? The two states are mirror images. The only difference is direction. One lies behind you and one lies ahead of you, but the experience, or rather the absence of experience, is identical. This argument has a strange, quiet power. It does not work the way a proof in geometry works, eliminating all doubt through the force of logical necessity. It works more like a shift in perspective, a reframing that, once genuinely felt, changes the texture of the fear itself. The fear of death, when you examine it carefully, often turns out to be the fear of an imagined experience, lying in a coffin in the dark, watching the world go on without you, being aware of your own absence. But these images are incoherent. They require a conscious observer at the scene of their own non-existence. You cannot watch the world go on without you because the you that would do the watching has ceased to exist. The horror of death, as Epicurus understood it, is largely a product of the imagination's failure to conceive of genuine nothingness. There are, of course, objections to this argument, and intellectual honesty requires that we consider them. The most serious is the asymmetry objection, first articulated clearly by the philosopher Thomas Nagel in a 1970 essay. Nagel argued that there is a genuine difference between prenatal and post-mortem non-existence. Before you were born, there was no you who was being deprived of life. After you die, there was a you, a specific person with specific experiences, relationships, projects, and pleasures, who has been deprived of more of them. Death is bad not because of what it is like to be dead, but because of what it takes away. The dead person has lost something the prenatal non-person never had. A life already underway, already valued, already invested in. The symmetry, Nagel suggests, is an illusion. Epicurus would not have been surprised by this objection. In fact, a version of it was already being raised in his own time. His response was characteristic. He would have asked, "Bad for whom?" If the person no longer exists, then there is no subject for whom the deprivation is real. A deprivation that no one experiences is not a deprivation in any meaningful sense. You cannot harm a person who does not exist. You cannot take something from someone who is not there. The feeling that death is a loss is a feeling experienced by the living, by those who contemplate the idea of death while they are still alive to be troubled by it. The actual state of being dead involves no feeling at all. There is another way to press the objection. We might distinguish between the fear of being dead, which Epicurus addresses, and the fear of dying, which is a different matter entirely. The process of dying can involve pain, loss of dignity, separation from loved ones, and the awareness of approaching annihilation. These are real experiences, suffered by a real person, and the fear of them is perfectly rational. Epicurus acknowledged this. He did not claim that dying is painless. His own death, as we have seen, involved considerable physical suffering. What he claimed is that the state of being dead, the permanent condition that follows the process of dying, is nothing to fear, because it is literally nothing. This does not resolve the debate. Philosophers continue to disagree about whether death is a harm, and if so, in what sense it is a harm. Some argue that Epicurus was right, and that the fear of death is irrational. Others argue that Nagel was right, and that death is a deprivation even if the dead person cannot experience it as one. Still others propose intermediate positions, distinguishing between the fear of the process of dying, which is rational because dying can involve pain, and the fear of being dead, which is irrational because being dead cannot involve anything at all. What is not in dispute is the practical effect of Epicurus's argument on those who genuinely absorb it. Lucretius, writing 2 centuries later, described this effect in some of the most powerful passages in all of ancient literature. Imagine, he wrote, that nature herself were to speak to a person complaining about death. She would say, "What have you to complain about? If your life was pleasant, why not retire like a guest who has had enough at a banquet? You have eaten your fill. You have enjoyed what was offered. Why insist on staying at the table after the meal is over? And if your life was not pleasant, why do you want more of the same?" In either case, the complaint makes no sense. You have had your time. Others will have theirs. The atoms that compose you will return to the void and be reassembled into other forms. This is not a tragedy. It is how the universe works. Epicurus himself modelled this teaching in his own death. The letter he wrote to Idomeneus on his final day, his body racked with the pain of kidney stones, is one of the most remarkable documents in the history of philosophy. He acknowledged the pain. He did not pretend it was nothing. But he said that against all this pain, he set the pleasure of remembering their conversations together, and that this pleasure was enough. He died as he had taught others to live, aware of the reality of suffering, but refusing to add to that suffering the unnecessary terror of what comes after. There is something Epicurus did not say, and it is worth noting because it matters. He did not say that death is good. He did not say that we should welcome it or seek it out. He did not say that life is without value. He said precisely the opposite. Life is the only arena in which pleasure, friendship, philosophy, and all the goods of human existence can be experienced. The point of removing the fear of death is not to make death attractive, but to make life livable. A person who is constantly afraid of death cannot enjoy the present moment, because the present moment is always overshadowed by the approaching end. Every pleasure is diminished by the knowledge that it will be the last, or the second to last, or simply one in a dwindling series. The meal tastes less vivid. The conversation feels more urgent. The sunset is beautiful and terrible at the same time. Remove the shadow, and the moment itself becomes visible. The food tastes like food. The conversation flows like conversation. The sunset is simply, perfectly, a sunset. The sunlight comes through. This is the second element of the 4-part cure. Death is not to be worried about. Not because life does not matter, but because death is not the kind of thing that can be experienced, and only experienced things can matter. The argument is simple enough to hold in your mind like a stone in your hand. Epicurus understood that philosophical arguments do not cure fear through their logical structure alone. They cure it through repetition, through familiarity, through the slow work of replacing an irrational habit of mind with a rational one. The student of Epicurus was meant to return to this argument again and again, not as an intellectual exercise but as a kind of therapy, until the truth of it became second nature. Where I am, death is not. Where death is, I am not. We will never meet. There is nothing to fear. No concept in the history of philosophy has been more thoroughly misunderstood than Epicurean pleasure. For 23 centuries, the word Epicurean has meant something in popular usage that is almost precisely the opposite of what Epicurus taught. To call someone an Epicurean today is to suggest a person devoted to fine food, expensive wine, luxury, and the refinements of sensual experience. It conjures images of silk robes and feasting tables, of a philosophy that places bodily indulgence at the centre of the good life. This caricature is so deeply embedded in Western culture that it has become the default meaning of the word. And it is wrong. Not slightly wrong, not a minor distortion, but fundamentally, comprehensively, and deliberately wrong. The distortion began in Epicurus's own lifetime, within the philosophical schools of Athens, where competition for students and prestige was fierce, and where rhetorical attacks on rival teachers were a standard part of intellectual life. His philosophical rivals, particularly the Stoics, attacked him as a teacher of base pleasures. They accused him of encouraging his followers to pursue sensual gratification without restraint. These attacks were not honest disagreements about the nature of pleasure. They were rhetorical weapons designed to discredit a philosophical competitor by associating him with the most disreputable interpretation of his central term. Epicurus knew what his opponents were doing, and he responded with exasperated clarity. When we say that pleasure is the goal, he wrote in his letter to Meneusius, we do not mean the pleasures of the profligate, or the pleasures that consist in having a good time, as some think who are ignorant of our teachings, or who disagree with them, or who interpret them badly. What we mean is freedom from pain in the body and freedom from disturbance in the soul. This is the heart of Epicurean ethics, and it requires careful attention because it overturns nearly everything that common sense assumes about pleasure. Epicurus distinguished between two types of pleasure. The first is the kind most people think of when they hear the word active, kinetic pleasure, the pleasure of eating when hungry, drinking when thirsty, the rush of sexual satisfaction, the thrill of a beautiful landscape. These pleasures are real, and Epicurus did not deny their reality or their value, but they are not the highest form of pleasure. They are temporary. They depend on a prior state of lack or desire. You cannot enjoy eating unless you are hungry, and to be hungry is to be in a state of discomfort. The pleasure of eating is the removal of that discomfort. Once the hunger is satisfied, the pleasure fades, and soon enough the hunger returns, and the cycle begins again. The highest pleasure, Epicurus argued, is not this fluctuating cycle of desire and satisfaction. It is the stable state that exists when the cycle is at rest. He gave it a name, the undisturbed mind, ataraxia, and he gave a parallel name to its physical counterpart, the body free from pain, aponia. Together, ataraxia and aponia constitute the summit of human well-being. They are not dramatic experiences. They are not ecstatic. They are not the kind of pleasure that makes you shout with joy or weep with gratitude. They are quiet. They are the pleasure of a body that is not hurting and a mind that is not worried. They are what most people would describe as feeling fine, and Epicurus's radical claim is that feeling fine, genuinely and completely fine, with no pain and no anxiety, is the best that life has to offer. Think of it this way. Imagine a day in which nothing goes wrong. You wake without pain. You eat when you are hungry and the food satisfies you. The weather is mild. No one you love is in danger. You have no obligations that fill you with dread. You spend time with a friend whose company you enjoy. You read something that interests you. You sleep easily at night. Most people, if they are honest, would describe such a day as a good day. Not a spectacular day, not a day of triumph or celebration, but a good day, a day they would happily repeat. Epicurus's claim is that this good day, this day of undisturbed well-being, is not a consolation prize. It is the prize. It is what pleasure actually is when you strip away the cultural noise that tells you it should be something louder, something more dramatic, something that costs more money. This claim strikes many people as austere, even disappointing. Surely the best that life has to offer is more than just the absence of discomfort. Surely there are heights of experience, moments of creative ecstasy, romantic passion, intellectual breakthrough, spiritual transcendence that exceed mere tranquility. Epicurus would have acknowledged the power of these experiences while questioning their reliability. The creative ecstasy is followed by doubt. The romantic passion is followed by jealousy, loss, or boredom. The intellectual breakthrough comes at the end of long frustration, and the satisfaction it provides is temporary. These peak experiences are valuable, but they cannot serve as the foundation of a good life because they are inherently unstable. They come and go. They depend on circumstances beyond your control. They cannot be maintained. Tranquility can be maintained. Or rather, tranquility can be cultivated through the systematic removal of the sources of disturbance. And once cultivated, it is far less vulnerable to external circumstances than any form of active pleasure. A person in a state of ataraxia does not need anything specific to happen in order to feel well. They need only the absence of disturbance, and the absence of disturbance is, by its nature, something that does not depend on luck, wealth, status, or the cooperation of other people. This is the practical genius of Epicurean ethics. It does not tell you to pursue something difficult to achieve and easy to lose. It tells you to stop pursuing things that are difficult to achieve and easy to lose, and to recognize that what remains when the pursuit stops is enough. To implement this, Epicurus developed a classification of desires that remains one of the most useful pieces of practical philosophy ever devised. All human desires, he argued, fall into three categories. The first is natural and necessary desires. The desire for food sufficient to sustain life, for water, for shelter from the elements, for clothing adequate to the climate, and for friendship. These desires are grounded in genuine biological and psychological needs. They can be satisfied relatively easily, and satisfying them produces real and lasting pleasure. The second category is natural but unnecessary desires. The desire for elaborate food when simple food would suffice. The desire for a large and comfortable house when a small one would provide adequate shelter. The desire for sexual variety beyond what a committed partnership offers. These desires are not wrong, but they are not essential, and pursuing them aggressively tends to create more anxiety than it resolves. The third category is empty desires. Desires that are neither natural nor necessary. The desire for fame, for political power, for great wealth, for the admiration of strangers. These desires are bottomless. They can never be fully satisfied because they have no natural limit. No amount of fame is enough for the person who craves fame. No amount of wealth is enough for the person who measures their worth by their bank account. These desires are the primary source of human misery, and the Epicurean remedy is to recognize them for what they are and stop pursuing them. There is also the question of bodily pain, which Epicurus addressed with a pragmatism that borders on the Stoic, though he would not have welcomed the comparison. Pain, he argued, falls into two categories. Intense pain is short-lived. Chronic pain is mild. The agony of a broken bone is real but temporary. The dull ache of a chronic condition is enduring but bearable. The worst case, intense and prolonged pain, generally leads to death. which is itself the end of all experience and therefore the end of all pain. This analysis may seem glib, and in the case of severe chronic illness, it undeniably simplifies a complex reality. But Epicurus was not offering a theory of pain management. He was offering a framework for preventing the fear of future pain from poisoning present tranquility. The person who spends today dreading the pain that might come tomorrow has doubled their suffering. They endure both the present anxiety and, if the pain comes, the pain itself. The Epicurean strategy is to meet pain when it arrives, endure it for what it is, and refuse to amplify it through anticipation. Epicurus lived this teaching. The garden was modest. The meals were simple. In one of his surviving fragments, he wrote to a friend, "Send me a pot of cheese so that I may have a feast when I want one." This is a man for whom cheese was a luxury, for whom ordinary bread and water were the standard fare. This was not a performance of poverty or a spiritual exercise in denial. It was a genuine expression of the Epicurean insight that most of what we think we need, we do not actually need, and that recognizing this fact is not a sacrifice, but a liberation. The liberation works like this. Consider a person who has trained themselves to need very little. Their food is simple but sufficient. Their home is modest but comfortable. Their clothing is adequate. Their friendships are deep and genuine. This person is, in the Epicurean analysis, wealthy in the only sense that matters. Their desires are small enough to be consistently satisfied. They are not anxious about losing what they have because what they have is easily replaced. They are not striving for what they lack because they lack nothing essential. Their life is not driven by the restless pursuit of more. It is sustained by the quiet enjoyment of enough. Now consider a person whose desires are elaborate. They need fine wine, not ordinary wine. They need a large house, not a small one. They need recognition, status, influence. This person may have far more than the first person in material terms, but they are, in the Epicurean analysis, poorer. Their happiness depends on conditions that are difficult to maintain and vulnerable to disruption. A change in fortune, a loss of status, a shift in public opinion, and the entire structure of their well-being collapses. They have built their life on foundations that they do not control. Epicurus did not condemn the enjoyment of fine things. He was not a Puritan. If you happen to have good food, enjoy it. If you happen to live in a beautiful house, appreciate it. The error is not in enjoying what fortune provides, but in needing what fortune provides, in making your happiness dependent on conditions that fortune can revoke at any moment. The wise person enjoys luxury when it comes and does not suffer when it goes. Their baseline of well-being is set by what is simple, natural, and reliably available, not by what is expensive, artificial, and precarious. There is a story, probably apocryphal but instructive, that Epicurus was once invited to a lavish dinner and enjoyed the food thoroughly. When asked afterward whether his usual diet of bread and water was not intolerably boring by comparison, he replied that, on the contrary, the simple meal was better, because he could have it every day without anxiety, while the lavish dinner depended on the goodwill of a host, the labour of servants, and the expenditure of money that might be needed for something else. The expensive meal tasted good but carried hidden costs. The simple meal tasted sufficient and carried no costs at all. Pleasure for Epicurus was always a net calculation, and when you subtracted the anxiety that accompanied most elaborate pleasures, what remained was often less than what a crust of bread provided for free. This teaching has a particular resonance for anyone who has ever felt the exhaustion of wanting too much, the sense that no achievement is enough, no purchase satisfying for more than a moment, no milestone capable of producing the lasting contentment it promised. Epicurus would diagnose this exhaustion as the predictable result of pursuing empty desires, desires that promise fulfillment and deliver only a brief interval of satisfaction followed by renewed craving. The treadmill, as modern psychologists call it. Epicurus identified it 23 centuries before the research confirmed it. There is a line from Epicurus that captures this with devastating simplicity. Nothing is enough for the person to whom enough is too little. The sentence works like a mirror. It shows you your own desires reflected back, stripped of their justifications, revealed as the bottomless things they are. The answer is not to run faster. The answer is to step off, to examine your desires honestly and ask which of them are grounded in genuine need and which are manufactured by culture, by competition, by the restless mind's conviction that something better is always just beyond reach. The things that actually matter, the food that sustains you, the water that refreshes you, the friend who knows you, are already here. They were always here, waiting for you to stop running long enough to see them. The work of Epicurean ethics is not the work of acquisition. It is the work of attention, the work of noticing what is already present, already good, already sufficient. The work is not to acquire more. The work is to notice what you have. Sometime in the centuries after Epicurus's death, an unknown Epicurean teacher took the entire philosophy and compressed it into 4 lines. God is not to be feared. Death is not to be worried about. What is good is easy to get. What is painful is easy to endure. This compression became known as the 4-part cure, the Tetrapharmakos, a word borrowed from medicine, where it originally referred to a remedy composed of 4 ingredients: wax, tallow, pitch, and resin, mixed together to treat wounds. The Epicurean Tetrapharmakos was a remedy too, but the wounds it treated were psychological: fear, anxiety, insatiable desire, and the dread of suffering. These were the 4 diseases of the human mind, and each line of the Tetrapharmakos prescribed a cure. The analogy with medicine was not incidental. It was central to the way Epicurus understood his own project. He did not see himself primarily as a theorist or a lecturer or a builder of logical systems. He saw himself as a physician of the soul. Philosophy that does not heal suffering, he said, is as useless as medicine that does not heal the body. This is a startling claim from a man who also developed a comprehensive physical theory of the universe, a detailed epistemology, and an intricate ethics. But Epicurus insisted that all of this theoretical work was instrumental, not an end in itself, but a means to the end of human well-being. You do not study physics for the intellectual pleasure of understanding atoms. You study physics so that you understand why there is nothing to fear from the gods. You do not study the nature of death out of morbid curiosity. You study it so that you can stop being afraid of it. Every branch of Epicurean philosophy leads back to the same destination: a life free from unnecessary suffering. The Tetrapharmakos is the concentrated form of that destination. It was meant to be memorized, carried in the mind like a talisman, available at any moment of crisis. A person lying awake at 3 in the morning, gripped by the fear of death, could recall the second proposition and begin to work through the argument. A person consumed by the desire for wealth or recognition could recall the third proposition and ask themselves whether what they were chasing was genuinely necessary or merely an empty craving that culture had taught them to mistake for a need. The Tetrapharmakos was philosophy made portable, an entire system of thought compressed into a form small enough to fit inside a single anxious mind. Each of its 4 propositions corresponds to one of the major fears that prevent human happiness, and each proposition rests on the arguments of Epicurean physics and ethics. What makes the Tetrapharmakos powerful is not the novelty of any individual claim, but the way the 4 claims fit together into a complete therapeutic system. Remove any one of them and the cure is incomplete. Keep all 4 and there is no form of psychological suffering that falls outside its reach. Let us take them one at a time, not to repeat what has already been said, but to see how each proposition functions within the Tetrapharmakos as a therapeutic instrument. The first proposition, God is not to be feared. This addresses the most ancient and most universal source of human anxiety, the belief that invisible, powerful beings are watching your behavior and will punish you for transgressions, either in this life or in the next. The Epicurean physics eliminates this fear at its root. The gods exist, but they are perfectly happy, perfectly self-sufficient, and entirely unconcerned with human affairs. They do not create natural disasters as punishments. They do not send plagues as warnings. They do not intervene in battles, curse families, or demand sacrifices. A person who has genuinely absorbed this truth lives in a different world from the person who has not. The sky is no longer threatening. The thunder is just thunder. The earthquake is just geology. The weight of divine surveillance, the feeling that you are always being watched and always falling short, lifts entirely. The second proposition, death is not to be worried about. This addresses the fear that shadows every human life, the knowledge that you will die, and the terror of what might come after. The Epicurean argument is precise. Death is the end of consciousness, the dispersal of the soul's atoms, and therefore the end of all experience. You will never be in a state of being dead. You will never know that you have died. The infinite time after your death will be, from your perspective, exactly like the infinite time before your birth, a period of non-existence that involves no suffering whatsoever. The person who has genuinely absorbed this truth does not lie awake at night fearing the void. The void is not something you will experience. There is no void to fear. The third proposition, what is good is easy to get. This addresses the anxiety of wanting, the restless conviction that happiness depends on things you do not have and may never obtain. The Epicurean classification of desires shows that the things genuinely necessary for a good life, food, water, shelter, and friendship, are available to almost everyone most of the time without extraordinary effort. The things that seem necessary but are not, fame, wealth, power, social status, are the products of empty desire, culturally manufactured cravings that have no natural limit and therefore can never be satisfied. The person who has genuinely absorbed this truth stops chasing what culture tells them to want and starts noticing what they already have. The bread on the table, the water in the cup, the friend across the room. These are not consolation prizes. They are the good itself. The fourth proposition, what is painful is easy to endure. This addresses the fear of suffering, the anticipation of future pain that poisons present happiness. Epicurus argued that intense pain is typically brief because it either resolves or kills, while chronic pain is typically mild enough to be endured alongside the pleasures that life continues to offer. He spoke from experience. His own health was never robust. Ancient sources mention recurring bouts of illness throughout his life, and his death from kidney stones involved 14 days of excruciating pain. Yet even in those final days, he wrote to his friends that the joy of philosophical memory outweighed the physical agony. This was not bravado. It was the practiced application of the fourth proposition by the man who formulated it. The worst suffering in the Epicurean analysis is not the pain itself, but the anxiety about pain, the mental amplification that transforms a manageable discomfort into an unbearable crisis. The person who has genuinely absorbed this truth does not add suffering to suffering by dreading what has not yet arrived. They deal with pain when it comes, bear it for what it is, and refuse to let the fear of it dominate the hours and days when they are not actually in pain. The four propositions are interconnected. The argument about the gods supports the argument about death, because if the gods do not judge you, then there is no posthumous punishment to fear. The argument about death supports the argument about desire, because if life is finite, then the accumulation of wealth and status beyond what you need is a waste of the only time you have. The argument about desire supports the argument about pain, because a person with simple needs is less vulnerable to loss and therefore less afraid of the misfortunes that might cause suffering. And the argument about pain supports the argument about the gods, because a person who understands that suffering is natural and manageable does not need to invoke divine punishment to explain why bad things happen. The Tetrapharmakos is not 4 separate remedies applied in sequence. It is a single remedy with 4 ingredients, and like the medical compound from which it takes its name, it works because the ingredients interact. The Epicurean tradition placed enormous emphasis on memorization and repetition of these principles. This was not intellectual laziness, it was therapeutic practice. Epicurus understood that knowing something is true and feeling that it is true are very different things. A person can know, intellectually, that death is not to be feared, and still lie awake at night terrified of dying. The gap between knowledge and feeling can only be closed through practice, through the repeated application of the right ideas until they become habitual, until they reshape the emotional landscape of the mind so thoroughly that the old fears lose their grip. This is why Epicurus wrote letters to his students that restated the fundamental doctrines in slightly different terms, approaching the same truths from different angles, embedding them deeper with each repetition. It is why the principal doctrines and the Vatican sayings take the form of short, memorable maxims that can be recalled in a moment of crisis. It is why the Tetrapharmakos itself is so compressed. 4 lines that can be held in the mind at all times, available whenever fear or anxiety threatens to overwhelm. One of the Vatican sayings captures this therapeutic method with particular clarity. Vain is the word of a philosopher by which no human suffering is healed. For just as medicine is of no use if it does not drive out bodily diseases, so philosophy is of no use if it does not drive out the suffering of the mind. This saying, attributed to Epicurus himself, makes the medical analogy explicit and non-negotiable. Philosophy is justified by its therapeutic results. If it does not make people's lives better, it has failed, regardless of how logically sophisticated it may be. This standard placed Epicurean philosophy in permanent tension with the more theoretical traditions of Plato and Aristotle, for whom the pursuit of knowledge was valuable in itself, independent of its practical effects. For Epicurus, the only knowledge that matters is knowledge that heals. There is something here that modern psychology would recognize. Cognitive behavioral therapy, developed in the 20th century and now the most empirically supported form of psychotherapy, works on a remarkably similar principle. Identify the irrational beliefs that produce emotional suffering, challenge them with rational alternatives, and practice the alternatives until they replace the original beliefs. The parallels are striking enough that several scholars have noted them, and at least one historian of psychiatry has argued that the ancient philosophical therapies, Epicurean and Stoic alike, represent the earliest systematic forms of what we now call cognitive restructuring. The Epicurean Tetrapharmakos is, in structure if not in theoretical framework, a cognitive behavioral intervention. It identifies 4 specific irrational fears, provides rational counter-arguments for each, and prescribes repeated practice as the mechanism of change. Epicurus would not have used these terms, but he would have recognized the method. The wall of Diogenes of Oenoanda, that massive stone inscription from the 2nd century CE, included the Tetrapharmakos prominently, carved into the rock so that anyone passing through the city could read it and begin the process of healing. Diogenes was an old man when he commissioned the wall, suffering from the ailments of age, and he explained in the inscription that he wanted to help not only the citizens of his own city, but the strangers who passed through it, offering them the medicine that had sustained him through his own life. The wall was public philosophy in the most literal sense, carved in stone, displayed in a public space, available to anyone who could read Greek. It was also an act of faith in the power of words to change lives. Diogenes believed that if you could get the right 4 sentences in front of a suffering person, the suffering could be eased. That faith may strike us as naive from the distance of nearly 2,000 years. The fear of death, the anxiety of desire, the dread of pain, these are deep structures of human consciousness, shaped by millions of years of evolution and reinforced by every culture that has ever existed. 4 sentences, however well crafted, may not be enough to dissolve them entirely, but the Tetrapharmakos does not claim to work instantly. It claims to work through practice, through the slow accumulation of rational conviction that gradually replaces irrational fear. It is a discipline, not a spell. It requires the same sustained effort that any form of mental training requires, the same daily attention, the same willingness to catch yourself in the act of irrational thinking and redirect your mind toward the truth. And for those who have practiced it seriously across the centuries, the testimony is consistent. It helps. Not perfectly, not completely, but meaningfully. The fears do not vanish, but they lose their dominance. They become manageable. The mind grows quieter. And in that quiet, the things that actually matter, the bread, the friend, the afternoon, the conversation that lingers in memory long after the words have ended, become visible again. The cure works, not by adding something to your life, but by removing the fears that prevented you from noticing what was already there. God is not to be feared. Death is not to be worried about. What is good is easy to get. What is painful is easy to endure. 4 lines, 1 remedy, a quiet revolution in what it means to be well. Of all the things that wisdom provides for the happiness of the whole life, by far the greatest is the possession of friendship. This is one of the principal doctrines, number 27, and it is perhaps the most surprising claim in the entire Epicurean system. Here is a philosopher who argued that pleasure is the highest good, that the wise person should withdraw from public life, that the ideal existence involves simplicity, self-sufficiency, and the absence of disturbance. And yet, when he was asked to identify the single most important contributor to human happiness, he did not say tranquility. He did not say the absence of pain. He did not say philosophical understanding. He said friendship. This was not a casual remark. Friendship occupied a central place in Epicurean philosophy and in the daily life of the garden. Epicurus wrote about it constantly. His surviving letters are, among other things, documents of friendship addressed to specific individuals with warmth, concern, and a degree of personal affection that is rare in ancient philosophical writing. He wrote to Idomeneus, to Hermarchus, to Metrodorus, to Colotes, to Leontion, and to dozens of others whose names survive only as addresses on letters whose contents are lost. The garden was not simply a school where philosophical instruction took place. It was a community of friends, and the friendships were not incidental to the philosophy. They were part of it. This requires explanation, because on the surface, the centrality of friendship sits uncomfortably with the rest of the Epicurean system. If you have spent the last several chapters absorbing the Epicurean emphasis on self-sufficiency and freedom from disturbance, you might reasonably wonder why the philosopher now places such enormous weight on something as inherently vulnerable and unpredictable as another person. If pleasure is the absence of pain and disturbance, and if self-sufficiency is the path to tranquility, then why make your happiness dependent on other people? Other people are unpredictable. They get sick, they die, they betray you, They move away. They change their minds. Every friendship is a hostage to fortune, an attachment that increases your vulnerability to loss and therefore to pain. The Stoics would later argue exactly this point, urging emotional detachment as a protection against the inevitable disappointments of human relationships. Why did Epicurus, who shared the Stoic emphasis on tranquility, take the opposite position? The answer lies in Epicurus's understanding of what human beings actually are. We are not solitary creatures by nature. We are social animals whose deepest needs include not only food, water, and shelter, but companionship, conversation, and the feeling of being known by another person. To deny this need in the name of self-sufficiency would be to deny something fundamental about human psychology. And Epicurus, for all his emphasis on freedom from disturbance, was always willing to follow the evidence of human nature wherever it led. The evidence said that people who live without friendship are miserable, regardless of how philosophically sophisticated they may be. The evidence said that the pleasures of conversation, of shared meals, of philosophical discussion conducted among people who care for one another, are among the most reliable and most sustainable pleasures available to human beings. The evidence said that friendship is a natural and necessary desire, not an empty one. But Epicurus was also a careful thinker, and he saw that friendship posed a genuine philosophical problem. If you value friendship because it is useful to you, because your friend provides you with pleasure, security, or practical assistance, then you do not really value your friend. You value what your friend gives you, and if someone else could give you the same thing, your friend would be replaceable. This is not friendship. It is a transaction. On the other hand, if you value friendship for its own sake, regardless of what it gives you, then you have admitted that something other than your own pleasure has intrinsic value, and the entire Epicurean framework, built on the claim that pleasure is the only intrinsic good, seems to wobble. Epicurus navigated this problem with characteristic subtlety. Friendship, he argued, begins in utility. We form friendships initially because other people are useful to us. They provide safety, companionship, assistance, and the pleasures of social interaction. There is nothing wrong with this. It is the natural origin of all human relationships. But genuine friendship does not remain at the level of utility. Over time, through shared experience, through the accumulation of conversations and meals and philosophical discussions and moments of mutual vulnerability, the friend becomes someone you care about for their own sake. The relationship that began as an exchange transforms into something that transcends exchange. You do not love your friend because they are useful. You love your friend because they are your friend. And this love, this genuine concern for the well-being of another person, is itself one of the greatest pleasures available to a human being. This is an elegant solution. It preserves the Epicurean claim that pleasure is the ultimate good while acknowledging that the deepest pleasures arise not from self-centered calculation, but from genuine care for others. The selfish starting point produces an unselfish result, and the unselfish result produces more pleasure than the selfish starting point ever could. Friendship is not a threat to tranquility. It is one of its primary sources. Epicurus also connected friendship to the social contract, an idea he developed in a way that anticipates modern political philosophy. Human beings, he argued, originally lived without laws, without social structure, in a state of nature that was not idyllic but dangerous. They formed communities not because they had an innate love of justice, but because cooperation was useful. They agreed, tacitly or explicitly, not to harm one another and not to be harmed, and this mutual agreement was the origin of justice. Justice, in the Epicurean view, is not a natural law written into the fabric of the universe. It is a human invention, a practical arrangement designed to reduce harm. And friendship is the highest expression of this cooperative instinct, a voluntary relationship in which two people agree to care for one another's well-being, not because they are compelled to, but because the pleasure of doing so exceeds the pleasure of living alone. The garden was the living demonstration of this theory. The community that gathered around Epicurus was bound together by philosophical commitment, but it was sustained by personal affection. The members ate together, studied together, celebrated holidays together, and mourned together when one of their number died. Metrodorus, one of Epicurus's closest friends, died before the master, and Epicurus's grief was real and undisguised. He did not attempt to achieve stoic indifference. He mourned. But he also remembered, and in the Epicurean system, memory is a source of pleasure that survives loss. The friend who has died lives on, in a sense, in the pleasure that the memory of their friendship continues to provide. This is not immortality. It is not a substitute for the presence of the living person, but it is something real, a genuine good that death cannot entirely destroy. The social composition of the garden was itself a philosophical statement. The inclusion of women was extraordinary. In Athens, women of citizen families were confined to the domestic sphere. They did not attend philosophical lectures. They did not participate in public intellectual life. They were, in the eyes of Athenian law and custom, permanent minors, under the legal authority of a father, husband, or nearest male relative. Epicurus ignored all of this. Women came to the garden and participated as philosophical equals. Leontian wrote and published. Themista, the wife of Leontian's son, was a philosopher in her own right. Other women whose names we know only from fragments and references contributed to the life and thought of the community. The inclusion of slaves was equally radical. Slavery was so fundamental to the structure of Athenian society that even the most progressive thinkers of the classical period failed to challenge it. Aristotle argued that some people are slaves by nature. Plato's ideal republic relied on a subordinate class. The Stoics, who taught that all human beings share in the divine reason, nevertheless accepted the institution of slavery as a social reality they were not obligated to change. Epicurus did not write a treatise against slavery. He did something more subversive. He welcomed enslaved people into the garden and treated them as human beings capable of the same philosophical development as anyone else. His most famous student from among the enslaved, Mies, became a respected member of the community. The philosophical implication was clear, even if Epicurus never stated it as a political argument. If a slave can achieve the undisturbed mind, if a slave can understand the nature of atoms and the mortality of the soul and the indifference of the gods, then the distinction between slave and free is a social convention, not a natural fact. Epicurus's political philosophy, to the extent that he had one, can be summarized in 2 words: live unnoticed. This advice, which has baffled and frustrated politically engaged readers for centuries, follows directly from the Epicurean analysis of desire. Political ambition is an empty desire. It has no natural limit. The politician who seeks power will always want more power. The public figure who seeks fame will always want more fame. These pursuits generate anxiety, conflict, enemies, and the constant risk of failure and humiliation. They are among the most reliable sources of mental disturbance that human life has to offer. The wise person, Epicurus taught, withdraws from public life and concentrates on the private sphere, on friendship, on philosophical conversation, on the simple pleasures that political turmoil cannot reach. This is not apathy. It is not a failure of civic responsibility, though it has often been criticized as one, both in antiquity and today. Plutarch, the great biographer and moralist, attacked the Epicurean withdrawal from politics as a betrayal of the duties that human beings owe to their communities. The Stoics saw it as a moral abdication. Even sympathetic modern readers sometimes feel uneasy with a philosophy that counsels retreat from the public sphere, especially in times of political crisis when withdrawal seems like a privilege available only to those who are not directly threatened by injustice. These criticisms have force. But Epicurus was not addressing the question of what society ought to look like. He was addressing the question of what an individual person can do to live well within the society that already exists. And his answer was a strategic choice about where to invest the limited resource of human attention and energy. The person who spends their life pursuing political power may change the world, but they will almost certainly sacrifice their own tranquility in the process. The person who cultivates a garden, literally and figuratively, may not change the world, but they will create a small space within it where human beings can live well. Epicurus believed, with a conviction born of watching the Hellenistic world tear itself apart through political ambition, that the second project was more valuable than the first. History has not been kind to this belief. The great Epicurean communities were eventually overwhelmed by the very political forces they sought to avoid, but the insight that political ambition corrodes personal happiness has never been refuted, and it has never been more relevant than in an age when the machinery of politics reaches into every corner of private life. The garden endured for centuries after Epicurus's death. It was led by a succession of heads, or scholarchs, beginning with Hermarchus, who had been with Epicurus from the early days in Lampsacus. The community maintained its practices with a faithfulness that speaks to the depth of the bonds Epicurus had forged. The shared meals, the philosophical discussions, the reading and memorization of the master's letters, the celebration of Epicurus's birthday on the 20th of each month, a tradition that the founder himself had established in his will as a permanent observance. Epicurean communities spread from Athens to Rome, to Antioch, to Alexandria, to cities across the Mediterranean world. Each community was a small garden, a local version of the Epicurean ideal of philosophical fellowship. A group of friends, living simply, studying nature, practicing the four-part cure, and offering one another the thing that Epicurus valued above all else: the shelter of each other's company against the storms of an indifferent world. There is a fragment from Epicurus that says, "Friendship dances around the world, announcing to each of us that we must wake up to blessedness." It is a strange and beautiful sentence from a philosopher not generally known for poetic language. The image of friendship as a dancer, circling the globe, calling out to people who have forgotten how to be happy, captures something essential about the Epicurean vision. Happiness is not a solitary achievement. It is not the result of individual effort applied to individual problems. It is something that arises between people in the space that friendship creates, and it reaches out to include anyone willing to listen. The dance is an invitation. The garden is where the music plays. And the door, as Epicurus made clear by the company he kept, is open to everyone. In January of 1417, a former papal secretary named Poggio Bracciolini was searching through the library of a German monastery. Poggio was a book hunter, one of a small group of Italian humanists who spent the early 15th century combing through the neglected libraries of European monasteries, looking for manuscripts of ancient texts that had been lost to the wider world for centuries. The monasteries had preserved these texts, in a sense, by copying them during the early medieval period for reasons that often had more to do with the physical value of parchment than with any interest in the contents. But preserved is a generous word. Many manuscripts lay unread in damp, poorly ventilated rooms, slowly disintegrating. Poggio knew that every month he delayed, another text might crumble into illegibility. He searched with urgency. Poggio was himself a remarkable figure. He had served as apostolic secretary to a succession of popes, including the antipope John the 23rd, whose deposition at the Council of Constance in 1415 had left Poggio temporarily unemployed and free to pursue his passion for manuscript hunting. He was a superb Latinist, a gifted calligrapher whose handwriting would influence the development of the Roman typeface, and a man whose love of the ancient world was so intense that every crumbling manuscript represented for him a voice from the dead that might still be heard if only someone could reach it in time. What he found in that German monastery, which was most likely the Benedictine abbey at Fulda, was a manuscript of a Latin poem that had not been widely read in Europe for 1,000 years. The poem was called De Rerum Natura, on the nature of things. Its author was Titus Lucretius Carus, a Roman poet who had lived in the 1st century BCE, and its subject was the complete philosophy of Epicurus, presented in 6 books of Latin hexameter verse with a literary power that rivals anything in the ancient world. Poggio did not fully understand what he had found. He was a humanist, not a philosopher, and his primary interest was in the quality of the Latin prose. But he recognized the text as significant and arranged for a copy to be made. That copy traveled to Italy, where it was read by Niccolo Niccoli, by Lorenzo Valla, by the scholars of the Florentine humanist circle, and eventually by a much wider audience. Within decades, the poem had been printed, circulated, and absorbed into the intellectual bloodstream of the Renaissance. Stephen Greenblatt, in his book The Swerve, argues that this rediscovery was one of the pivotal moments in the birth of the modern world. The claim is ambitious, but it is not unfounded. To understand why, we need to go back to Lucretius himself. Almost nothing is known about his life. The biographical tradition is thin and unreliable. St. Jerome, writing 4 centuries after Lucretius's death, claimed that the poet was driven mad by a love potion, wrote his poem during intervals of sanity, and killed himself at the age of 44. Most modern scholars regard this story as a Christian-era fabrication, designed to discredit the author of the most powerful atheistic text in the ancient world by portraying him as insane. The strategy was effective. For centuries, the madness story was the first thing anyone learned about Lucretius, and it served to preemptively undermine the credibility of everything he wrote. What we do know is that Lucretius composed De Rerum Natura around 55 BCE, approximately 2 centuries after Epicurus's death. The poem was written during one of the most violent periods in Roman history. The Roman Republic was tearing itself apart in a series of civil wars that would eventually destroy it and give rise to the autocratic rule of the emperors. Julius Caesar was consolidating power. Pompey was maneuvering against him. Street violence, political assassination, and the collapse of republican norms were the daily reality of Roman public life. Lucretius wrote his poem in the shadow of this chaos, and the poem bears the marks of its moment. Its urgency, its passionate desire to liberate its reader from fear, its insistence that there is a way to live well even when the world is falling apart. These are not academic exercises. They are the responses of a man who saw his civilization destroying itself and believed he knew why. The poem is addressed to a Roman aristocrat named Gaius Memmius, and its declared purpose is to convert Memmius to Epicurean philosophy. But the real audience is anyone who will listen. Lucretius writes with the zeal of a convert and the technical mastery of a poet who ranks alongside Virgil and Catullus in the history of Latin literature. He takes the technical details of Epicurean physics, the atoms and the void, the swerve, the mortality of the soul, the indifference of the gods, and transforms them into passages of extraordinary beauty and emotional force. Consider his account of the fear of death. Lucretius does not merely state the Epicurean argument, he dramatizes it. He imagines nature herself confronting a person who complains about dying. What have you to grieve about? Nature asks. If your past life has been pleasant, why not leave like a guest who has had enough at a banquet, you fool, and take your rest in peace? And if all your pleasures have been poured away and lost, and life is an offence, why do you seek to add more, only to have it all wasted again and lost without any pleasure? Why not rather put an end to life and trouble? The passage is devastating in its clarity. It takes the abstract Epicurean argument and gives it a voice, a personality, a dramatic force that pure philosophical prose cannot match. Book 1 opens with a magnificent invocation of Venus, the goddess of love and creative force, whom Lucretius addresses not as a literal deity, but as a personification of the generative power of nature. The invocation is followed almost immediately by an attack on religion, illustrated by the story of Iphigenia, the Greek princess sacrificed by her father Agamemnon to appease the goddess Artemis and gain favourable winds for the voyage to Troy. Such great evil could religion prompt, Lucretius writes, in a line that would echo through the centuries. He uses the story to establish his central theme, that religion, far from being a source of comfort and guidance, has been a source of cruelty and suffering throughout human history, and that the purpose of his poem is to free the reader from its grip. Or consider his treatment of the swerve. Where Epicurus had proposed the swerve as a necessary postulate to account for free will, Lucretius turns it into a vision of cosmic creativity. The tiny, unpredictable deviation of atoms from their downward path is what makes everything possible. The collision that produces the first compound, the first complexity, the first stirrings of life. Without the swerve, the atoms would rain down through the void like drops of rain falling in still air, never meeting, never combining, never producing anything at all. The swerve is what breaks the fatal decrees of fate, what prevents the universe from being a deterministic machine in which every event is merely the inevitable consequence of the event before it. The swerve is what makes the world. Book 3 of the poem, On the Mortality of the Soul, contains some of the most powerful philosophical poetry ever written. Lucretius marshals argument after argument against the immortality of the soul, each one driven home with examples and images that make the abstract concrete. The soul grows and ages with the body. It is affected by wine, by disease, by physical injury. It falters in childhood and declines in old age. It can be healed by medicine, which would make no sense if it were immaterial. These are not gentle philosophical suggestions. They are a sustained assault on one of the deepest human convictions, delivered with a literary force that makes the arguments almost impossible to ignore. Book 5 offers an extraordinary account of the history of civilization, tracing the development of human society from the earliest primitive communities through the invention of language, fire, metallurgy, agriculture, law, and religion. Lucretius presents this history as a natural process, driven by human ingenuity and the accidents of experience rather than by divine guidance. Religion, in his account, arose not from genuine revelation, but from human ignorance and fear. People saw frightening things they could not explain, imagined powerful beings behind them, and created systems of worship to appease those imagined beings. This naturalistic account of the origin of religion was incendiary in a Christian Europe that regarded religion as the product of divine revelation, and it helps explain why De Rerum Natura was treated with such suspicion for so long. The poem was not entirely lost during the medieval period. It was known to some readers, quoted occasionally by scholars, and listed in medieval library catalogues. But it was not widely copied, not widely read, and not part of the standard educational curriculum that preserved the works of Virgil, Ovid, Cicero, and other Latin authors. The reasons for this neglect are not hard to guess. The poem's central claims, that the gods do not govern the world, that the soul is mortal, that pleasure is the highest good, that the universe has no creator and no purpose, were diametrically opposed to the fundamental doctrines of medieval Christianity. A monastery would copy Virgil because Virgil could be read as a pagan prophet of Christ. A monastery would copy Cicero because Cicero's moral philosophy was compatible with Christian ethics. But a monastery had no reason to copy Lucretius and every reason not to. That the poem survived at all is a testament to the imperfect efficiency of cultural suppression. The process by which ancient texts were transmitted through the medieval period was precarious and contingent, depending on the decisions of individual scribes and librarians whose motives are largely unknowable to us now. Somewhere, in some monastery, a scribe copied the text, perhaps out of duty to preserve all Latin literature, regardless of content, perhaps out of scholarly habit, perhaps out of a curiosity that the scribe's superiors would not have approved. That copy survived. Other copies were made from it. And eventually, Poggio Bracciolini walked into a library and found one of them. The rediscovery of De Rerum Natura sent ripples through the intellectual world of the Renaissance. The poem's atomic theory contributed to the revival of interest in natural philosophy that would eventually lead to the scientific revolution. Its account of the mortality of the soul challenged the theological certainties of medieval Christianity and contributed to the more skeptical and questioning spirit of the New Age. Its naturalistic account of the origin of religion influenced the development of the critical study of religion that would emerge in the 17th and 18th centuries. Its celebration of pleasure as the highest good resonated with the humanistic emphasis on earthly life and human experience that characterized the Renaissance at its best. Scholars debated the poem in the universities. Artists drew on its imagery. Botticelli's Primavera may owe something to the invocation of Venus with which the poem opens. The long-silenced voice of Epicurus, channeled through the poetry of Lucretius, was speaking again, and this time there was no institutional power capable of silencing it. Lucretius gave Epicurus something that Epicurus's own surviving writings could not provide: a voice. The 3 letters preserved by Diogenes Laertius are compressed, technical, and written in a deliberately plain style designed for memorization rather than persuasion. The principal doctrines and the Vatican sayings are collections of maxims, powerful in their concision, but lacking in the kind of sustained argument and imagery that can move a reader emotionally. Lucretius supplied all of this. He made the philosophy breathe. He gave the arguments narrative momentum, dramatic tension, and emotional weight. He took a system of thought that could seem cold and austere in its abstract formulation and showed that it was, in fact, a passionate response to the deepest questions of human existence. Without Lucretius, Epicurus would be a footnote. We would know that he existed, that he founded a school, that he taught something about atoms and pleasure and the indifference of the gods. We would have the fragments and the letters and the maxims, enough to reconstruct the outlines of the system, but not enough to feel its power. De Rerum Natura is what made the difference. It carried the voice of a man who had died 2 centuries before Lucretius was born across 2 more millennia, through the collapse of Rome, through the long silence of the medieval period, through the damp rooms of neglected libraries, into the hands of a book hunter in a German monastery, and from there into the modern world. Montaigne read it and was influenced. Giordano Bruno read it and was burned at the stake for holding views that owed much to its atomism. Galileo read it. Newton read it. Thomas Jefferson owned at least 5 copies and declared himself an Epicurean. It is the bridge between the ancient philosophy and the modern world. It is the poem that saved the philosophy. The persecution of Epicurus began before he was dead. During his lifetime, rival philosophers attacked him with a venom that went far beyond ordinary intellectual disagreement. The Stoic Chrysippus wrote entire treatises against him. The skeptic Timocrates, a former student who had left the garden under bitter circumstances, circulated malicious stories about Epicurus's personal life, accusing him of gluttony, debauchery, and intellectual fraud. These early attacks established the pattern that would define the reception of Epicureanism for the next 23 centuries. Not engagement with the arguments, but the destruction of the philosopher's character. The strategy was devastatingly effective because it exploited a vulnerability built into the Epicurean system itself. Epicurus taught that pleasure is the highest good. This claim, stated without the careful qualifications that Epicurus always attached to it, sounds like an endorsement of hedonism in the worst sense of the word. All an opponent had to do was strip the claim of its context, ignore the distinction between kinetic and static pleasure, overlook the classification of desires, disregard the emphasis on simplicity and self-sufficiency, and present the naked proposition that pleasure is the highest good. Then the slander writes itself. A philosopher who teaches pleasure is obviously a glutton, a drunkard, and a sensualist. His garden is obviously a den of licentiousness. His female students are obviously his concubines. None of this needs to be true. It only needs to seem plausible, and it seems plausible because the word pleasure, detached from its Epicurean meaning, conjures exactly the images that the slanderers intended. The attacks intensified after Epicurus's death, as his philosophy spread with remarkable speed across the Hellenistic world and into Rome, attracting followers among all social classes and in cities from Sicily to Syria. Roman moralists found Epicureanism particularly objectionable because it counselled withdrawal from public life, and Rome was a culture that prized civic engagement above almost everything else. A Roman citizen was expected to serve the Republic, to seek office, to command armies, to participate in the governance of the most powerful state in the Mediterranean world. The Epicurean advice to live unnoticed was, from this perspective, a betrayal of the most fundamental Roman values. Cicero, who was sympathetic enough to Epicureanism to present it fairly in his dialogues, nevertheless dismissed it as a philosophy unsuitable for men of action. Other Roman writers were less generous. The poet Horace joked about being a pig from the herd of Epicurus, a phrase that captured the popular perception even as it acknowledged the philosophy's appeal. But the real war against Epicureanism began with Christianity. The reasons are not difficult to understand. Epicureanism and Christianity disagree on virtually every point that matters. Epicurus taught that the gods do not intervene in human affairs. Christianity teaches that God created the world, sustains it, and intervenes in it constantly. Epicurus taught that the soul is mortal and that death is the end of consciousness. Christianity teaches that the soul is immortal and that eternal life or eternal damnation awaits every human being after death. Epicurus taught that pleasure, understood as tranquility, is the highest good. Christianity teaches that virtue, understood as obedience to the will of God, is the highest good. Epicurus taught that the universe has no creator and no purpose. Christianity teaches that the universe was created by God for a reason, and that human life has a divinely ordained meaning. The conflict was total. There was no room for accommodation, no possibility of synthesis, no way to baptize Epicurus the way the Church would later baptize Plato and Aristotle. The Platonists could be recruited because their theory of eternal forms could be mapped onto the Christian concept of divine ideas. The Aristotelians could be recruited because their prime mover could be identified with the Christian God. Even the Stoics could be partially absorbed because their emphasis on natural law and divine providence resonated with Christian theology. But Epicurus denied divine providence, denied the immortality of the soul, denied that the universe has a purpose, and taught that pleasure is the meaning of life. He was, from the Christian perspective, the most dangerous philosopher in history. The early church fathers attacked him relentlessly. Lactantius, writing in the early 4th century, dismissed Epicurus as a man who reduced human life to the level of animals by making pleasure the goal. Augustine, the most influential theologian in Western Christianity, treated Epicureanism as the definitive example of philosophical error, a system that promised happiness but delivered only moral corruption. Clement of Alexandria, Origen, Jerome, Ambrose. One after another, the major figures of early Christianity lined up to condemn the philosopher from the garden. The language that the fathers used is revealing. They did not merely disagree with Epicurus, they reviled him. They treated his philosophy not as a competing theory to be argued against, but as a disease to be eradicated, a corruption of the soul that threatened the salvation of anyone who encountered it. This emotional intensity tells us something important about the threat that Epicureanism posed to Christianity. A philosophy that can be easily dismissed does not need to be attacked with this kind of ferocity. You attack with ferocity what you fear, and what the Church feared about Epicureanism was its persuasive power. It offered an alternative to the Christian promise that was genuinely attractive, a way to live without fear that did not require faith, that did not require obedience, that did not require the surrender of rational autonomy to religious authority. If Epicurus was right, then the Church was unnecessary, and the Church could not afford to be unnecessary. The condemnation was not merely intellectual, it was also material. The Christian Church, as it grew in power and influence during the 4th and 5th centuries, gained control over the institutions that preserved and transmitted texts. The monasteries became the primary centres of manuscript production. The monks who copied texts made choices about which texts to copy, and those choices were not random. Works that were useful for education, that were compatible with Christian doctrine, that served the needs of the Church in some way, were copied and recopied. Works that were hostile to Christian teaching, that argued against divine providence, that denied the immortality of the soul, that celebrated pleasure as the highest good, were not copied, or were copied rarely, or were copied only to be refuted. The result was a slow but systematic erosion of the Epicurean textual tradition. Epicurus had written roughly 300 scrolls. By the early medieval period, almost all of them were gone. Not burned in a dramatic act of censorship, though such events certainly occurred in the ancient world, but more commonly and more insidiously, simply allowed to decay through deliberate neglect. The manuscripts were not copied. The copies that existed deteriorated. Within a few centuries, the vast corpus of Epicurean writing had been reduced to the 3 letters and the collections of maxims that Diogenes Laertius had included in his biographical encyclopedia, plus whatever fragments survived in quotations by other authors. The destruction was not total, but it was thorough enough that Epicureanism, once one of the 3 major philosophical schools of the Hellenistic world, became a ghost, a name without a body, a reputation without a text to support or refute it. In the vacuum left by the lost texts, the caricature flourished. Epicurean became a general-purpose insult meaning godless, materialistic, and devoted to base pleasures. Medieval preachers used it to condemn anyone they considered insufficiently pious. The word lost all connection to the actual teachings of Epicurus and became a label for a type of sinfulness. Dante, in the Inferno, placed Epicurus and his followers in the 6th circle of hell, the circle reserved for heretics. They lie in burning tombs, sealed shut by the wrath of God, punished for the specific heresy of believing that the soul dies with the body. Dante almost certainly never read a word that Epicurus wrote. He knew Epicurus only through the hostile accounts of Christian writers and through the general cultural understanding that Epicurean meant someone who denied the afterlife. He placed him in hell for denying a doctrine that would have been the centre of Epicurus's defence, that the fear of posthumous punishment is irrational because there is no posthumous experience. The irony is exquisite. A philosopher whose life's work was to free humanity from the fear of punishment after death is punished after death in the most famous poem in Western literature. Epicurus would not have been surprised. He had spent his lifetime watching rival philosophers and religious authorities attempt to discredit his teaching, and he had predicted that the superstitious would continue trying to silence him long after he was gone. He had counseled his followers to live unnoticed, partly to avoid exactly this kind of retribution, but the ideas proved harder to kill than the texts. Throughout the medieval period, Epicurean ideas survived in fragments, in quotations embedded in hostile critiques, in the occasional scholar who read Lucretius or Diogenes Laertius and found something there that resonated. When the Renaissance began and the humanists started hunting for lost manuscripts, the ground was prepared for a recovery that no amount of suppression could prevent. Poggio found Lucretius. Lorenzo Valla wrote a dialogue on pleasure that gave the Epicurean position a sympathetic hearing for the first time in a millennium. Pierre Gassendi, a French priest and philosopher of the 17th century, mounted a systematic rehabilitation of Epicurean philosophy, arguing that it was compatible with Christianity in its essential features, even if not in its details. Gassendi's atomism influenced Robert Boyle, whose work on the behaviour of gases laid the foundations of modern chemistry, and Isaac Newton, whose corpuscular theory of light drew on the Epicurean tradition of explaining physical phenomena through the behaviour of tiny particles. Gassendi's revival of Epicurean physics contributed directly to the scientific revolution, providing a philosophical framework for the new experimental science that was emerging in the 17th century. The Enlightenment embraced Epicureanism with an enthusiasm that would have horrified the medieval church. The philosophers of 18th century France, many of them explicitly anti-clerical, found in Epicurus a philosophical ancestor whose rejection of divine providence and religious superstition matched their own. Baron d'Holbach, Denis Diderot, and Voltaire all drew on Epicurean ideas, directly or indirectly, in their critiques of organized religion and their arguments for a morality based on human happiness rather than divine command. Thomas Jefferson, writing in 1819, declared, "I am an Epicurean." He saw in Epicurus a philosopher who grounded ethics in human experience rather than divine command, who valued friendship and simple pleasures over wealth and power, and who taught that the good life is available to everyone, not just to the fortunate few. Jefferson's famous phrase, "the pursuit of happiness," enshrined in the Declaration of Independence, owes more to Epicurus than to any other single source, though the intellectual genealogy runs through Locke and the English empiricists rather than directly back to the garden. The utilitarians of the 18th and 19th centuries, Bentham and Mill, built their ethical systems on a foundation that Epicurus would have recognized immediately: the claim that pleasure and pain are the ultimate criteria of moral evaluation. Bentham's greatest happiness principle is, in essence, the Epicurean ethics scaled up to the level of social policy. Mill's distinction between higher and lower pleasures echoes the Epicurean distinction between static and kinetic pleasure, even if Mill did not draw the parallel explicitly. The thread runs unbroken, however thin it sometimes becomes, from the garden in Athens to the foundations of modern ethical thought. The pattern repeats. Every time the philosophy is suppressed, it resurfaces. Every time it is declared dead, it reappears in a new form, adapted to a new context, speaking to new anxieties, but carrying the same essential message: the atoms and the void, the indifference of the gods, the mortality of the soul, the redefinition of pleasure as tranquility, the centrality of friendship, the liberation from fear. These ideas have proven impossible to kill. Not because they are simple, though they can be stated simply, not because they are comfortable, though they offer a profound form of comfort, but because they address something real, something permanent in the human condition that no amount of religious authority or cultural pressure can wish away. People are afraid. They are afraid of death, of divine punishment, of not having enough, of suffering. And here is a philosopher who says, you do not need to be. Here are the reasons why. Here is the evidence. Here is the argument. And here, in this garden, is a community of people who have found that the argument works. Karl Marx wrote his doctoral dissertation on the difference between the atomic philosophies of Democritus and Epicurus, finding in the Epicurean swerve a model for human freedom within a materialist framework. The influence runs deeper and wider than most intellectual histories acknowledge, because the influence often operates underground, through channels that are deliberately concealed by thinkers who knew that an open embrace of Epicureanism could still damage a reputation even in the supposedly enlightened modern era. A philosophy does not survive 2,000 years of active, deliberate persecution unless it is telling the truth about something important. In the 21st century, in a world that Epicurus could not have imagined, his diagnosis of human unhappiness has become more relevant than at any point in the last 2,000 years. We live in a civilization that has solved, at least in the materially developed world, most of the problems that Epicurus's contemporaries faced and that most human beings throughout history have faced. We have reliable food supplies, effective medicine, heated homes, clean water. The material conditions that made life precarious for most of human history have been, for a large portion of the world's population, largely overcome. And yet the anxiety has not diminished. If anything, it has intensified. Depression, generalized anxiety, chronic stress, insomnia, burnout. These are the defining psychological conditions of our time. Something is wrong, and the wrongness is not material. It is spiritual, in the Epicurean sense of the word. It is a sickness of the soul. Epicurus would have recognized the symptoms immediately. He would have seen a civilization drowning in empty desires, in cravings that have no natural limit and therefore can never be satisfied. He would have seen the pursuit of fame conducted through social media platforms that promise connection and deliver comparison, that promise community and deliver isolation, that promise validation and deliver an endless, exhausting performance of a self that exists only for the consumption of strangers. He would have seen the pursuit of wealth elevated to a cultural religion, a system of belief in which your net worth is your moral worth, in which more is always better, in which enough is a concept that has been systematically erased from the vocabulary of aspiration. He would have seen the pursuit of status through the acquisition of objects that are designed to become obsolete, replaced by newer objects that will themselves become obsolete, in a cycle of consumption that generates enormous profit for the producers and enormous anxiety for the consumers. And he would have said, I told you 23 centuries ago. These desires are empty. They have no natural limit. They will never make you happy. They will only make you want more, and the wanting will consume your life. The modern anxiety epidemic, as psychologists and sociologists have documented it, maps with remarkable precision onto the Epicurean analysis of empty desires. The research on the hedonic treadmill, the phenomenon by which human beings quickly adapt to improvements in their circumstances and return to a baseline level of happiness, confirms what Epicurus argued on philosophical grounds, that the pursuit of more does not produce lasting satisfaction. The research on social comparison, the finding that people evaluate their own well-being not in absolute terms but relative to the people around them, confirms the Epicurean warning that the desire for status is bottomless because there will always be someone who has more. The research on materialism and well-being, the consistent finding that people who prioritize material acquisition over relationships and experiences report lower levels of happiness and higher levels of anxiety confirms the Epicurean classification of desires. The things that actually matter are simple and available, and the things that seem to matter are elaborate and insatiable. None of this would have surprised Epicurus. He did not have functional magnetic resonance imaging or longitudinal studies or randomized controlled trials. He did not need them. He had the argument, derived from careful observation of human behavior and rigorous philosophical reasoning, and the argument was correct. Modern empirical science has confirmed, with data and statistical significance, what a man sitting in a garden in Athens figured out 23 centuries ago by thinking carefully about what makes people miserable. The resurgence of interest in Epicurean philosophy among contemporary thinkers is not accidental. It is a response to a specific cultural moment, a moment in which the traditional sources of meaning and consolation, religion, community, shared purpose, stable employment, and deep relationships have been eroded by the forces of modernity, and nothing adequate has replaced them. The secular world has freed itself from many of the fears that Epicurus fought against. Most educated people in the developed world no longer fear divine punishment. Many no longer fear death in the religious sense, as a gateway to judgment and possible damnation. The Enlightenment did its work, and the scientific revolution did its work, and the slow, uneven process of secularization has, in much of the developed world, drained the old religious terrors of their power. A modern person in London or Berlin or San Francisco is unlikely to lie awake at night fearing the wrath of Zeus or the fires of hell. But the liberation has been incomplete. The old fears have been replaced by new ones. The fear of insignificance, the fear of missing out, the fear of not achieving enough, the fear of being ordinary in a culture that demands extraordinariness. And against these new fears, the old religions have little to offer, because the new fears are precisely the kind that religion has historically exploited rather than cured. Epicurus offers something different. He offers an ethics that does not depend on God, that does not require faith, that does not demand the surrender of rational autonomy. He offers a framework for evaluating desires that cuts through the noise of consumer culture with surgical precision. Is this desire natural and necessary, natural but unnecessary, or empty? The question itself is therapeutic. Simply asking it forces a moment of reflection that the culture of constant consumption is designed to prevent. And the answer, more often than not, is clarifying. The desire for the next upgrade, the next promotion, the next milestone of social recognition. These are not natural and necessary, they are empty. And recognizing them as empty is the first step toward freedom from the anxiety they generate. The philosopher Catherine Wilson, in her book Epicureanism at the Origins of Modernity, argues that Epicurean ideas have quietly shaped the modern world in ways that are often unacknowledged. The emphasis on empirical observation over dogmatic authority, the insistence that natural phenomena have natural explanations, the skepticism toward claims of divine intervention, the value placed on individual happiness as a legitimate goal of human life. These are foundational assumptions of modern secular culture, and all of them have Epicurean roots. We are all, in a sense, more Epicurean than we realize. The philosophy that was supposed to have been destroyed has instead become the water in which modern secular culture swims. Emily Austin, in her book Living for Pleasure, makes the case that Epicurus speaks to the specific anxieties of the 21st century more directly than any other ancient philosopher. The Epicurean emphasis on friendship as the foundation of the good life addresses the epidemic of loneliness. The Epicurean critique of empty desires addresses the exhaustion of consumer culture. The Epicurean acceptance of mortality addresses the secular world's uneasy relationship with death, its tendency to avoid the subject entirely rather than confronting it and discovering, as Epicurus promised, that there is nothing there to fear. There is also the matter of death. The secular world has not, for the most part, developed a satisfying relationship with mortality. Religion offered a framework for understanding death, however frightening that framework sometimes was. Death was a transition, not an ending, and what came after depended on how you lived. Secularism removed the framework without replacing it. The result is a culture that avoids the subject of death with extraordinary determination, treating it as a medical failure rather than a natural event, warehousing the dying in institutions where they are hidden from daily life and responding to grief with discomfort rather than understanding. Epicurus offers this culture something it badly needs, a way of thinking about death that neither denies its reality nor surrounds it with terror. Death is the end, and the end, understood properly, is nothing to fear. But the question that Epicurus leaves us with is not theoretical. It is practical. What would it actually look like to live without fear? Not as a slogan on a wall, not as a philosophical maxim to be memorized and recited, but as a daily practice, a way of being in the world that is informed by the Epicurean insights and transformed by them. It would look, Epicurus suggests, something like this. You wake in the morning and you do not immediately reach for the device that connects you to the anxieties of the world. You eat simply and notice that the food is good. You spend time with someone you care about and the conversation is unhurried because you are not performing for an audience. You do work that matters to you, not because it will make you famous or wealthy, but because the doing of it is satisfying. You notice the quality of the light at a particular hour, the sound of rain against a window, the warmth of a drink in your hands on a cold evening. You do not catalogue these experiences for public display. You do not photograph the meal to show someone who is not at the table. You do not narrate the walk to an audience that will scroll past it in 2 seconds. You simply have the experiences, fully present in the having of them, and the having is enough. You do not fear the gods because you do not believe that the universe is governed by a personality that watches you and judges you. You do not fear death because you understand that it is not an experience and therefore not something that can harm you. You do not chase what you do not need because you have learned to distinguish between genuine desires and manufactured ones. You do not dread pain because you know that most pain is either brief or bearable, and the anticipation of pain is worse than the pain itself. This is a modest vision. It is not a vision of heroism, of world-changing ambition, of ecstatic transcendence. It is a vision of an ordinary life, lived well. A life of bread and water and friendship, and the occasional piece of cheese. A life in which the baseline of happiness is set not by achievement, but by awareness, by the ability to notice what is already good, and to stop reaching for what is not necessary. Whether this vision is enough depends on who you are and what you want. For some, the Epicurean life will seem too quiet, too withdrawn, too modest in its ambitions. For those who want to change the world, who are driven by a vision of justice, or beauty, or truth that demands public engagement and personal sacrifice, Epicurus may seem like a philosopher of retreat, a man who turned his back on the suffering of the world to tend his garden. This criticism has force. Epicurus does not address the problem of injustice except by advising you to avoid the political arena where injustice is contested. He does not inspire the revolutionary, the activist, the reformer. His genius lies elsewhere. His genius lies elsewhere. It lies in a quieter, more personal, and ultimately more durable contribution to the question of how to live. His genius lies in the recognition that most human suffering is self-inflicted, not all of it. Poverty is real. Oppression is real. Disease is real. But the suffering that Epicurus addresses, the suffering of fear, of insatiable desire, of anxiety about things that have not happened and may never happen, is suffering that arises from within. It is suffering that you do to yourself, through the habits of mind that culture has taught you and that philosophy can help you unlearn. The fear of death, the fear of the gods, the conviction that you need more than you have, the dread of future pain. These are not imposed from outside. They are generated from within. And what is generated from within can, with practice, with patience, with the right philosophical tools, be changed from within. This is the promise of Epicurus. Not that you will never suffer, but that you will stop suffering unnecessarily. Not that the world will become kind, but that you will become free. Not that death will be defeated, but that the fear of death will be seen for what it is, a shadow cast by the imagination, a phantom that dissolves when you look at it directly. 23 centuries after a man bought a modest garden on the outskirts of Athens, the invitation still stands. The gate is open. The bread is on the table. The conversation has already begun. The only question, the question Epicurus always leaves with you, is this: what would you stop wanting if you understood that you already had enough? Thank you for spending this time here tonight. I hope it was restful, wherever you are. I would love to know where in the world you are listening from and what time it is as you hear this. Leave it in the comments if you feel like it. If this episode helped you rest, subscribing helps others find the channel, and it means a great deal. If you enjoyed this, you might also enjoy our episodes on Marcus Aurelius or Kierkegaard, both of which explore what it means to live a philosophical life. Good night.